Hello CS112, today I'll be going over a quick solution to Lab 9, which had to do with file I/O. So I'm just going to dive right into it. The function you created would do is you would be given an input file in a specific format, and you were to implicitly create an output file with your code. These formats I will talk about in a sec, but you had to calculate how many words were in each line of the file inputs. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create this input file by going here, going to new file, and then with this new file, I'm going to save it as, and I'm going to make sure it's in the same directory as this code file, which I know it is. And I'm going to name it something meaningful, such as input text. Now, a lot of you guys were, excuse me, getting that error of you weren't able to find input text within your code file, and for some of you, reasons, some of your guys' systems, if you would name this input text.txt, it would save as input text.txt with the extension .txt, so it would be input text.txt.txt in your actual folder. I don't know why some of your systems do that, but I'm just going to go ahead and save it as input text, and the file extension will be implicitly tagged on at the end with the file type. So when I hit save, as you can see, input text.txt is implicitly added. Now, I'm just going to quickly type up the formats of what we know the input text would be. So you have the word sentences, a colon, a space, and then this class is really interesting. I enjoy programming, period. I learned a lot this semester, period. And I can't wait to learn about file I/O. So this is what you were guaranteed to get, this structure here, where you would have the title, a space, and then a variable amount of sentences with a variable amount of words in every sentence. And what you wanted to do, give as an output, I kind of left it here, is you wanted to return how many words were in each of these sentences, as well as, have the title there with a space and then words, word in that sentence, words, number of words in that sentence. You can see here, 5 words in this sentence, 3 in this sentence, 6 and 8 in the last one. So we want to be able to count each of those. So let's just begin. Let's come up with a code skeleton so we will know what to do when we're actually going through it. So the very first thing we need to do is we know that we need to open our input file, we need to read it to gather this information, and then we need to write it to our output file. So we want to open input file in, let's say, we want to, in reading mode. And then the next thing we want to do, as I described, is open outputs file in writing mode. So now I will be able to read and write all I want to. Obviously, it's very important that I close files at the end here. Now, I always, when writing my opening file code, I always just add the closing code immediately, just so I don't forget. And then let's go on with what we need to do. So obviously, we want to be able to skip these first 2 lines, but right now I'm going to worry about this formatting later and just see if I can write to my output file the correct number of words in each sentence. So I'm going to space there. Oopsies. The first thing I'm going to do is loop through my input file. Now, if I were to just say file equals input file in the reading mode, and I was to loop through that, I can simply say for I in file input, and each element in that iteration would be a line within that specific file. So when I'm iterating through that, I need to come up with a way to count words in each, I'm going to say elements in parentheses because technically is an element, but it's not really an array, but count words in each element. And how am I going to do that? Well, they did give hints at the bottom, very good hints, and I'm going to be using split in this solution. I'll talk about that in a sec. But once we have counted the number of elements, I'm going to write number of words of each element to output file. Alrighty, so this is generally what I'm going to be doing, but obviously we're going to be pragmatic about it and test as we go. I'm going to save that. I'm also going to save this. And first I want to check if these guys are in the right location. So I'm going to open up a new terminal. I'm going to check what's in my current directory, and I'm not even in the right directory. So type, I believe, where am I right now? Okay, let me just really quickly go to where I need to go. All right, so now, as you can see, I'm in the correct directory where I have my code file and the input texts all together. So let's first focus on actually calling this function. So you would call it like any other function here. I'm just going to, first I'm going to define file input and file outputs. I'm just going to say fi equals the input file I've created, so that's input text.txt, and I'm going to make that a string because you have to do that with file names. So this is the file that it's going to be looking for, and the file it's going to be creating, which I'm going to call fo, is going to equal, let's call it output text.txt so it makes sense. So call it output text, and then I'm actually going to call the function. So file, oopsies, word counter with my fi and my fo. So again, file names in quotes. Now I'm going to do these first two steps before I start running my code here. The first step is open a file in reading mode. So I'm going to say file in is equal to open, and then what are we going to do? Well, I'm going to simply say file inputs in R. R is reading mode. I just want to read this file, and file inputs is equal to fi, because that's how I'm calling it, and fi is equal to the input text.txt file that I've already created. The next thing I'm going to do is open my file out folder, which is file out equals open file outputs, the file output parameter, followed by W, which is the writing mode. Now, something that's special about this writing mode is obviously we haven't created this file yet. File output, which is fo, which is output.text.txt, is not within this folder. Whenever you use a W while doing file IO with this open commands, if it doesn't find whatever you're trying to write to in this current directory, it will create it for you implicitly. So let's just go ahead and check out what happens when I do this. I'm going to save this real quick, and then I'm going to run Python followed by my code name. I'm going to hit enter, and then I'm going to hit ls. Look, it has created output text.txt, whereas before it did not. So I'm just going to continue on now. I'm pretty sure this was all pretty straightforward to what you guys have learned thus far. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to loop through my input file. So I'm just going to say for I in, or let's say for line, so we're a bit more concise. For line in, file in. Let's print line and see what line is. I'm going to save that. I'm going to run that again, and whoopsies. File in is not defined. Did you mean file in? I did. So where did I mess up here? Capital N accidentally. I'm gonna redo that. All right, so we have, I'm gonna make this a little bigger. We printed out our file here, our input text. We've printed out every single line. Now notice how there is an empty space here because line is going to equal this empty row one time. So the first line is sentences, the second this empty space, and then so on and so forth. So now we need to come up with a way to count the words in each element. I just realized that I had this comment here, and it should be underneath everything because you want to close your files at the end. And I should have added my close file code at the beginning. So let me just do that real quick. Let me go ahead and type in file in dot close and file out dot close. If I can type today. Okay, so now that we know that line is going to be every single element in, excuse me, every single line within input text, I want to figure out how to get the word count of each line. So I'm going to work with line now, so we know that line is now going to be every single line within the text document we're examining. I'm going to create a word count variable, oopsies, and set it equal to the length of every single line dot split at every single space. So now let's examine what dot split does. Dot split is a string method or function that takes a string, such as this guy right here, and it will split said string at whatever you put within the parentheses here as an argument, and wherever it splits, it'll add that as an element in your list. So like, let's say we have this, just as an example, we have this right here as our string. When we call dot split on it, it will return, let's say, string dot split at the spaces. It will, I'm just going to make this more clear, I'm going to say string equals this. If I say string dot split at the spaces for an argument, it will return a list where the first element is, I, the second is learns, and then, you know, so on and so forth. The next will be a lot this semester. So it'll return a list of that. So if I set word count equal to the length of this, it'll be the length for how many words are in this sentence, since it'll be split at each space. So now the length of it will be the word of the sentence. So now we have the word count. How do I write to a file? Well, I write to a file using .write, which was also mentioned on the PDF and this week's lab PowerPoint. So now to write, I will say file, I want to write it to my file out, .write, and I'm going to write word count. So I'm going to save that, run it, and see what happens. So I'm going to type in python cat.py, and it's saying, yes, I'm supposed to, the argument in .write must be a string, not an int. So I am going to use str and wrap this bad boy in parentheses to convert it to a string before I write it to the file there. Python cat.py, obviously no output. However, let's go ahead and check our output text file that we've created. Now we have these numbers here. Well, these numbers do look kind of iffy, but this is actually the correct outputs. Now, I know you guys are wondering why these two ones are there, but I'll get to that in a second. But as you can see, at our expected output, we got 5, 3, 6, and 8, and we have 5, 3, 6, and 8 here. However, we're also returning a 1 and a 1 because we are checking these first two lines here, the one with sentences and the empty line, which we should not do. So right now, I'm actually just going to make it a little more readable, I'm going to add a, whoopsies, within my write statements, I'm going to add a new line character so we can have everything on a new line. It's more readable. Again, I'm going to save that. I'm going to run my code. I'm going to check my output text, and now everything is on a different line, so it's a little more readable. Now, how can I skip the first two lines? Well, again, this was also on the PDF and in this week's PowerPoint, but I'm going to use the file function called readLine. Now, what does readLine do? Well, when you first open a file in reading mode, so we've opened file input, we open input.text.txt as a readable file, you have a file pointer. You can imagine a little pointer pointing to the very first line in the file. Every time readLine is called, it's going to move down one. So if I said file name.readLine, it will move down. File name.readLine, it will move down. Since we know that this is the exact format where we want to skip the first two lines before going on, we can simply do this before we enter our loop. We can simply skip first two lines, and we can do file in read line. Now it's line, not lines. Lines will send you to the end of your thing. And I'm going to call it again, file in.read line, because we can do this because our file in is our input file here. So again, when I first open file in right here, it will be pointing to the first line. When I call file in.read line, it'll read this line and move on to the next one. Now it's pointing to this line. When I call read line again, it'll read whatever's on this line and go to the next one. So now when I loop through file in, it will start where all my words are. So I'm just going to save this real quick. I'm going to run it again. And now my output text only has the numbers I desire. So yeah, we were only able to do this because we knew the exact structure of the input text. And some of you guys were confused about why this works and why you didn't have to like save it and anything. And you can totally call read line like this. You don't have to work with it in any way. You could say like, if you really wanted to store the header and stuff, you could say like x equals file.readline. This will still move the file pointer of file in down to the next line. But the way that I've called it here is perfectly fine, as I showed you in my code. So now the next thing we need to do is start formatting. So the format here, we want to get sentences followed by a space followed by words in each one of the print statements. So first, let's work on the sentences. I'm going to add a title. I'm doing this before my for loop because, well, we only have one title. And I'm going to do the same operator as before, where I say, I'm going to write to my output file, writes, and then within here, I'm going to say sentences, yikes, with a colon followed by 2 new lines. Now, why am I doing 2 new lines? Because, well, there's a new line at the end of here, and I also want this space between the rest of my work. So that's why I'm going to have 2 new lines. If I run that again, test out my code, check out my output file, well, now I have a new line here followed by a space between numbers. Lastly, we want words with a colon and a space before our word count, which I can concatenate here by simply saying words, space, and concatenating it with our word count. If I hit S there, run that bad boy, check our output, and we have the expected output. So this was a pretty straightforward lab if you guys have been working on this current project or have been showing up to class. So if you have any questions, let me know and I will get back to you ASAP.